Hey everyone, welcome to That Jesus Podcast. I'm here tonight with Titus and our guest who we'll introduce in just a minute, Merle Burkholder. Hey Titus, how is it going down there in Virginia? Do you guys have any snow yet?
No, we don't really have a lot of snow anymore. It's going pretty well. I was on a roof today because, there's no grass to mow, putting down metal. And I'm always reminded whenever I make the mistake of agreeing to do construction for somebody, how much I hate construction. And I think roofing is like the worst because, you're standing on this steep roof all day in the cold with the wind biting at your nose and your face. It's just pretty miserable. So there's some complaining to get us started here. Since we're talking about caring for the poor today, here I'm a rich Westerner complaining about my situation. So
yeah, well, I'm on vacation. I'm on vacation this week because I'm a school teacher, and we get a whole week and a half or almost 2 weeks of vacation. So we're down here in Nebraska, and we have lots and lots and lots and lots of snow right now. But how do you usually spend your vacation when you go and visit people?
I don't do a lot of vacation, especially not in 2020, but we are actually going to go get an Airbnb with my brother who was just on the podcast recently, Tim.
Nice.
In Baltimore next week, so that should be a good time. Mostly just sit around and dream about missions and try to convince him to come to India with me is basically probably what that will consist of.
Nice. It sounds a lot like me. I was telling my wife just a minute ago, I was like, yes, we're down here visiting her sisters in Nebraska, and this is my chance for her to catch up with her family, and I can sit down and catch up on work and church stuff and writing, but that doesn't quite work because I'm sitting here doing a podcast with you on vacation, and she's up there wishing I was with her. But I'm really glad we're here. I've actually been reading this book, Mere Discipleship by Lee Camp, actually rereading it. It's really, really amazing. It comes from a professor from the same tradition I grew up in, the Church of Christ. And the first place I heard of it was at a Mennonite Bible school in Chiang Mai, Thailand. And the professor that recommended the book to me was none other than our guest tonight, Merle Burkholder. And I didn't even think about it. I just picked it up off the bookshelf before I left last night. And I didn't even think until I made the connection just now. I had reading this book because Merle required us to read it, 15 years ago, Merle?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, so this is Merle Burkholder, and he's a friend of mine, and I've really enjoyed getting to know him when I was serving in Thailand, and he was on the board at the Institute for Global Opportunities. Always an encouragement, inspiration, sometimes had to help me work through mental roadblocks, and it's really great to have you here tonight, Merle.
Well, it's good to be here.
Are you up in Sioux Lookout?
Actually, I'm in Thunder Bay.
Okay.
I have a medical appointment tomorrow, and so we came to Thunder Bay today, and be here overnight, and then go home tomorrow. So, yeah, Titus, you're talking about not having snow. Our high temperature today was about 0. So,
Oh boy, my dad grew up in Canada, so he loves that kind of stuff. But I hate it, having grown up in Africa, very near the equator. I can't stand it. So, yeah.
So, Titus, why don't you tell us what we're talking with Merle about tonight?
Yeah, so Brother Merle is the director or the president, I'm not sure what your official title is, of Open Hands, which is a ministry that works in developing countries, basically addressing poverty and some of the issues there, which is one of our core values on this podcast, caring for the poor. And we haven't actually done any episodes specifically on this, although Christy Smooker touched on it a bit. So I am really excited to get into it. This kind of became something that was heavy on my heart when I first read Radical by David Platt, which is also when I got interested in unreached people groups. But he talks a lot about like poverty statistics and that sort of thing in that book as well. And the one statistic that has always jumped out to me most is that, and I don't know what it is in 2020, I assume it's similar, but he said that around 26,000 children will die every day from starvation or preventable diseases. And often, like, that's just a statistic and we can brush by it. But having been to India and, had little kids come up to me on the street and beg for food and seeing little kids having to work in mango fields all day rather than go to school, seeing kids sweeping the train, like just nasty working conditions, having to work all day instead of going to school. Like it breaks my heart, especially when I'm in those situations. And then it's easy to just get back into normal life and kind of forget about it. But Eric Ludy has this analogy where he says that if you had a kid in the developing world who was hungry and didn't have shelter and was destitute, like you would call every one of your friends and you would say, get on a plane, go find my child and rescue him, you know? And God is looking down and these are his children. And so like if we really feel the heart of God, I think that we will feel the way he does about not just these children, but anyone who suffers from poverty. So there's my little sermon to get us started.
Amen.
But maybe to get things going here, I do want to hear, Merle, about your ministry and how you are addressing those needs. But there's an ethical dilemma that I've thought a lot about, and it's the fact that like literally any money that we use on ourselves unnecessarily. So after the rent's paid or the mortgage, after you buy groceries, clothes, whatever you need, any money that you use on yourself or I use on myself unnecessarily could have gone to save someone's life, save a child who's starving, or, you know, care for someone who's in desperate need. And so like it almost feels like we're making a trade when we spend money on ourselves unnecessarily. Like we're valuing our comfort or our luxury in the moment more than we're valuing like the child who we could have donated $2 to the ministry that would have given this child the medical treatment or whatever he or she needed. And that has like really bothered me. And for a while I tried to live where I spent zero money on myself. And I don't think that's healthy either, because we are given all things richly to enjoy. So I don't quite live that way anymore. But it really is an ethical dilemma. So why don't we start there, and we'll come to you, Merle. How do you deal with that reality?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think just being aware of the situation of how most of the world lives, like North America, the Western world is the exception to the way people live in the world. Most people don't live the way we do. And if we don't know how most of the world lives, then it's easy to compare ourselves to other North Americans, and we can always find someone who has more than we do, and kind of justify what we want to do because we're not Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos or somebody like that, and so we're good. We're still um, middle class or upper middle class. But I think there's value in facing the struggle, and just a story that from my own life. I'm not a mechanic, and I wanted to have a snowmobile to do snowmobiling with my children, but I felt like I could only afford old snowmobiles, and then they would never start, and I couldn't keep them running because I didn't know how to fix them, and so I got frustrated, and finally I said, okay, I'm not having a snowmobile anymore. And one of my friends told me, well, Merle, you have to buy a new snowmobile, and then it'll start. I said, I can't afford to buy a new snowmobile. And he said, of course you can. Like, you can buy a new snowmobile for $5,000, and then when it's 10 years old, you can sell it for 2,500. So it costs you $250 a year to have a snowmobile. And if you can't afford $250 a year for a snowmobile, you have other money problems. So just do it. But when I thought about that, am I going to actually spend $5,000 for a snowmobile? Like, I could build two houses in Haiti for families that don't have houses. And so am I going to spend $5,000 for a snowmobile so I can go snowmobiling with my children when there are people that I know personally whose houses are falling down and their roofs are leaking? And, you know, there's just value in that struggle and being aware of the choices we're making. And I believe in uh, living a fairly normal lifestyle where we are. Um, but I do think that one of the things that's helpful is to think about, okay, so if I'm going to buy a snowmobile for 5,000, is it important enough to me that, like, what if the snowmobile was 10,000? Would I still buy it? And so let's pretend this, let's just, in my mind, let's just pretend that the snowmobile's 10,000. So I'm going to buy it for 5,000, and then I'm going to buy the snowmobile and I'm going to build two houses in Haiti. Or I really want that $5 coffee from Starbucks, but is that an extravagance? But if it was $10, would I still buy it? And so maybe I can buy this $5 Starbucks and I can give $5 to to someone who's in poverty. And because we live in a society where we have the ability to earn wealth and produce wealth, and
Hmm.
I don't think that just kind of minimizing our lifestyle and earning less and doing less so that we're not wasting money. I just don't think that's the answer. But I think there's ways to kind of wrestle with that question. And I think there's sometimes where we decide, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm, I'm. It's just not. There's just more important things in the world
Hmm.
than what I would like to have at the moment.
I think for me, I often this you're saying it's good to have that struggle, but that is a really tough struggle, and I can't handle the cognitive dissonance of buying a $5 coffee and knowing, that this could buy, two Bibles for somebody in China or something. And so I kind of shut it out because it's really hard. But your point, you personally know people in Haiti that would benefit from having a house built. You know them personally. And I think that kind of changes it from an ethical dilemma to a real opportunity, and shifting the conversation from like this ethical dilemma to saying, hey, I know people personally. I've seen the need, I've felt the opportunity, and I want to give to this as I can. Somehow reality is clarifying that way.
Yeah, it takes it out of a theoretical argument into reality, and that's why I think it's important for North Americans to get out of North America for a significant period of time and actually build friendships
Hmm.
in underdeveloped countries because it changes. It's like Scripture says, where your treasure is, there your heart is also, and where our relationships are, that's where our heart is. And so, um, it just changes how we think about it when we actually know the people and we have relationships. Like Titus is talking about seeing the children in India, and that just changes. It just changes something for us.
Yeah, and I think also thinking about it positively, like you were saying, Drew, that this is actually something that I can do that will bring me joy as well, caring for the needs of these people rather than feeling guilty about, spending money on ourselves, actually seeing it as an opportunity. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, that's good.
Yeah,
Um,
a wise person told me one time, um, you'll never make yourself happy with your own money. You can make other people happy with your money, but you'll never make yourself happy with your own money. I thought
yeah,
that was a good word.
yeah. So, what are some principles from the life and teachings of Jesus that can speak to how we can care for the poor effectively, and just encouragement from Jesus to care for the poor in general?
Well, Jesus talked a lot about the poor and about money. He actually, I think he talked about money more than any other subject. One of the things that I have my class do at IGO is read through the Gospel of Luke and just jot down all the references to money or things having to do with money in the Gospel of Luke. And actually, to do that in the New Testament is a good exercise, but
Hmm.
that's pretty daunting. But if you can get through one of the Gospels. The Gospel of Luke is a good one. And some of those things, I've had students, well, it's not uncommon for students after they do the assignment to say, so what would it look like if somebody actually lived like this? What if we actually
Yeah.
did this? Because there are some passages that we read over pretty quickly, and or we find ways of say, well, it kind of means you do this, um, and rationalizing it. But one of the things that I think is informative is that Jesus did things for people that they couldn't do for themselves. Like the feeding of the 5,000, for example. There were the people, they were hungry, and the disciples said, well, should we send them away? And he's like, no, you feed them. And I'm like, well, how are we going to do that? Shall we go buy food? Shall we spend all that money for food? And he's like, well, what do you have? And he could have said, oh, you know what? Yeah, you guys, all you have is these 5 little loaves and 2 fish, and that's nothing with the crowd we have to feed. So you're right. That's yeah, what you have is so insignificant. Here, let me fix it for you. And he could have created like three donkey loads of food and just out of nothing and said, oh, okay, there you go. I now you have what you need and whenever you need something, just come and talk to me. I'll give it to you. And but he didn't do that. He started with what they had them act in faith, and then using what they had, he intervened and did the rest. The interesting part of that story is the next. Well, it's in John, but in the next chapter in John, well, Jesus goes across the lake at night. The next day, the people come around the lake and say, "Where were you? And how did you get over here?" And Jesus says to them, "Well, you're following me because I fed you yesterday." And and they were like, "Well, they get into the discussion about who he is, and and they're saying, "Well, what sign are you going to give us?" And he's saying, "Well, what sign?" And they wind up saying, "Well, Moses, like he fed our forefathers in the wilderness for 40 years." And so basically what they were saying is, you had a good start yesterday, and another 39 years, 11 months, and 29 days, and you're gonna at least be at the level of Moses. And Jesus just point blank told, no, that's not what this is about. And he didn't start a daily feeding program. Um, he did that in the moment when there was the need. The people would have been glad to have him feed them every day. They would have followed him
Mhm.
en masse, and he could have had a feeding program. Um, but Jesus stresses generosity, um, doing things for doing things for those that can't do it in return. Like when you have a dinner, invite the poor, invite the lame, and don't invite those that are going to invite you back. Um, he talks about what is it, what value is it if you gain the whole world and lose your own soul, and give to the person that asks of you, and the one that would borrow don't turn away. And um, the parable of the good Samaritan is just another example of helping those that are in need that we come in contact with. um, um, yeah, there's just so many things that Jesus talked about in relation to the poor that I think are helpful when we think about our interactions with the poor.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Well,
I think that issue of dependence is one of the reasons why so often we shy away from getting involved or engaged with
For
the
sure.
poor, because we've had bad experiences, or we've tried and it didn't seem to help, and people just are back. Like you have somebody that doesn't have money to pay their rent or their electric bill, and you help them out, and then next month they're back again and say, "Well, I need help again." And I think I think we struggle with knowing what really helps, and
mhm.
how do we, and then we create a dependence, and it's the same thing that Jesus faced with the people following him around the lake. And
Mhm.
and looking for bread again the next day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's drill down into that a little bit more because that is one of the most common objections that I face when I talk about caring for the poor or doing humanitarian aid work is, people will say, well, you're just creating dependence, they need to learn to work hard for themselves and that sort of thing. And I'm not sure who it was who wrote the book When Helping Hurts. Have either of you read that book?
Brian Fickert is the author of that.
Okay. Yeah, I need to put that on my reading list for 2021. But I obviously I know the idea. I know that many times it can create situations like that. I know that was one of the biggest problems that my parents faced in Kenya growing up. So, what are some ways that helping can hurt, and what are some bad ways of caring for the poor that create those dependencies, and then what are some alternative good ways?
Well, there's three in that book, When Helping Hurts. Brian Fickert lays out three types of aid. First of all, there's relief. Secondly, there's rehabilitation, and thirdly, there's development. But relief is like after a hurricane or an earthquake, people just need shelter, they need food, they need water, and to go in, do that, provide that is is good. It needs to happen, and there's a time to just give things and just say, yeah, this is an emergency situation, and here I'll I'll give it to you. Um, but when relief becomes a long-term program, then it becomes detrimental. One of the things that happened in Haiti after the earthquake in 2010, they had 600,000 people living in tent cities, and the big aid agencies came in. They raised billions of dollars, and they came in and they distributed food and water, tents. Basically, they just took care of those 600,000 people that were living in the tent cities. But nobody put any thought into how do we get these people back out of the tent cities. And they had money and they kept spending the money, and then eventually their billions of dollars were finished, and then they're like, oh, now what do we do? And the people who were in the tent cities were almost in a worse situation than they were a month or 6 months after the earthquake, because they they had no place to go, and now the aid programs were finished, and and people weren't going to be sending billions of dollars to keep feeding hundreds of thousands of people in tent cities. Then they started to think about what they should do, which is what should have happened 2 weeks after the earthquake. Somebody should have been strategizing,
Yeah.
how are we going to get these people out of the tent city? What's the long-term plan here? But as long as there was money, they just kept feeding them. And where it becomes detrimental is when we keep giving and giving, we keep providing relief when really the time comes where there's a need for rehabilitation. And what those people in the tent city needed was they needed help to rebuild their houses. A lot of them had land, they had a place where they had been living before the earthquake. They needed help to get their houses rebuilt. And eventually, some of the aid agencies did what should have been done a year after the earthquake, is they started giving people $2,000 or $3,000 so that they could rebuild their house and they could move out of the tent city and go back to where they were. But that was delayed, and but rehabilitation is where the pieces are there, but somebody needs to. There's a little bit of capital or something's needed to put the pieces back together. In this case, the people had land, but they needed the resources to get their houses rebuilt. Um,
Sure.
and development is where there are new skills that need to be learned, and maybe there's a potential to develop maybe organic coffee uh, um, raising or something, but the people don't know how to do it. And you go in and you teach how to raise coffee and help to develop the market. And but what happens is a lot of times relief programs start out of a heart of compassion, but in the long term, they actually uh, become detrimental. And transferring wealth from the rich to the a simple transfer of wealth from the rich to the poor is, in my opinion, never going to eliminate poverty. If it would, the big aid agencies would have solved the problem of poverty a long time ago. Uh, And so it just doesn't work. When we went to Africa, what we do in Open Hands is we do savings group programs. We don't give out any money. We just help people form groups, and they make loans to each other. They help each other.
Hmm.
When we went to Africa and introduced our savings group program there, we had a presentation in one of the churches where we presented what we do. At lunchtime, I sat beside one of the African men, and he said to me, I understand what you're talking about. But he said, what you don't realize is that there are people in our churches that are never going to do what you're saying they should do because they're on a support program. They're on the widow's support program. They know exactly how much they can earn every year to stay on the widow's support program, and they are never going to cross that line because they're only looking at what they're going to lose. But he said what they're not thinking about is if they would cross that line this year, maybe they'd be worse off. But maybe in 3 years from now, they'd be way better off than they would be if they stay on the widow's support program. And he said the other thing they're forgetting is their children are watching them, and their children are learning when you grow up, the way you make a living is you find some support program that you qualify for, and then you get on that program and you make sure you never get off of it. And their children are going to grow up with that mentality, and their children are going to be in the same situation.
I
I
hope
told
you
him,
hired that guy. I hope you
I
hired
told him,
that guy. He
I
sounded
told him,
smart.
I know what you're saying is true, but there are some people here who are going to say, I'm going to do that, and there are some people who aren't sure, and they're going to watch the people who do it, and they're going to see what those people do, and then they're going to say, okay, if they did it, I can do it. And then there are some people who will never get off the support programs, and we can't do anything for them, so they can just stay on the support programs. Uh, but there's a fair number of people that um, will work to better their own situation.
So your organization does provide, or organizations that you interact with do provide long-term financial support, like the widow program you mentioned, even though it does create a dependency. Like sometimes I've heard people drawing a hard line. Well, I'm not going to help people unless they're willing to help themselves. And in my time in Asia and even here in the US, there are those people who just, it seems like they will never, they almost like they don't have the hardware, the mental hardware to actually help themselves. And I don't want to be this raging capitalist that says, well, if you're not willing to help yourself, I'm not going to help you. Where do you come down on that? If there is a dependency, yeah, you can do what you can to wean people off, but you just said that some people won't. What do you do with those people?
Yeah, we partner with organizations that do have support programs, and what we're doing is we're offering an alternative um,
Okay.
that some people will choose to follow, and so some people will get off of the support programs, while others, excuse me, while others may stay on the support programs. We don't provide any funding for the support programs, but we do partner with organizations that do have support programs.
And so with that, you're not saying that there's something fundamentally immoral about helping people who aren't going to help themselves. That's what I've heard. That's what I hear sometimes from some people.
No, I think like God cares about the widow and the orphan, and I
Yeah.
think widow support programs, I think orphan support program, like the child sponsorship programs, are some of the most effective charitable programs in the world as far when they track results over the long term. Some of the orphan support programs are have proven to be very effective, and so no, I'm not a person who says we should never give anything, but to have that be the only thing we do.
Yeah.
Um,
We need more tools in our toolbox.
right.
We need to use them.
Yeah. And we do savings groups. That's the only thing we do, but that doesn't mean that it's the only thing that should be done there.
Hmm.
It's one, like you say, it's one tool, and it
Hmm.
works for some people.
My wife
And
and
you,
I support some children through Compassion International. Is that a ministry you recommend? Do you think that's effective?
Yeah. Um, there's been studies done on child orphan support programs, and Compassion was one of those organizations. And the difference between children who are on the support program and children who are not, even in, yeah, there's just a big difference in the outcomes.
And you said that you actually don't give any money to the community. You're not actually giving out like microloans or anything. You're actually just providing a framework for them to be able to give loans with accountability to each other.
Yeah, what we do is we go in and we help them form groups, and we provide teaching and and some we provide some help for them if they get stuck with the mechanics of running a group. But we don't put any seed money into the group. We don't provide any funding for the groups. It's all done with their own money. And and what we want, like we have probably in we're in 10 countries, and we have probably about 70,000 people in savings groups in those 10 countries.
Wow.
We only have uh, uh, we only have 4 North American staff. All the rest is done with national staff. We try to keep a North American face away from the groups. So when I show up in a savings group, it's not like, yeah, we're doing your savings group program and it's really working. They don't even know who I am. It's like I'm
That's
some
great.
guy from Canada who's interested in their group, and I can say, well, show me what you did, and oh, they have all their records, and they're all excited about, yeah, this is how much we saved, and we gave each other loans, and this is what we were able to do,
And you're like, that's a great idea. Who came up with that idea?
yeah, no, so I can really compliment them on what they've done, and but there's something about doing it themselves. And
It feels like such a kingdom sort of thing to be modeling and equipping people to give to each other rather than someone from the outside to come in, instead to be helping create communities. Is the giving, is the loan, are the loans happening within like Christian communities, or is this open for anybody?
it depends on the group. Each group makes their own policies. Some groups are only for members of a particular church. Some groups are only for Christians. Some groups use the group for evangelism, so they intentionally bring in 10 or 20% of their members as unbelievers, so that they can use it for evangelism. So it really depends.
Mm-hmm.
It really depends on the group.
How does, do you ever see negative impact? I know that, like, you think about the book of Proverbs talking about how the borrower is slave to the lender. How does the lending dynamic impact relationships?
Um, well, we give them advice on how much they should loan to one person. So, for example, we encourage them not to loan someone more than twice as much as what they've have saved. So, for example, if someone has $20 saved and you give them a $200 loan, they might not be able to pay it back, and then it becomes a bondage thing where they're in. But if a person has $20 saved and you loan them 40, they can probably pay back another 20, and at the end of the saving cycle comes, they have at least $20 saved. They just have to come up with 20 to pay back their loan, and so that keeps it from becoming kind of a bondage thing.
Can you tell us about maybe some of the positive aspects this has on relationships?
Um, what happens is, like, we really stress trust. One of the things that I believe that the solution to poverty is relationships, and I believe that what causes poverty is broken relationships.
Hmm.
And first one of those, the most important relationship, is our relationship with God, and then secondly, it's our relationship with others, and then thirdly, it's our relationship with self and the way we see ourselves, and then fourthly, our relationship with creation. And so we work at restoring relationships. And what happens in the groups is, first of all, we address the relationship with God, and and teach biblical financial principles. Secondly, we really work on trust within the group and forming a small community where people really care for each other and they really help each other. And that community, then, see what happens is if I go into a community and I give one person $100, that person, if he's suddenly a rich person in the community, what's going to happen? Everybody's going to steal from him because he's got more than everybody else. But when a group works together and they all make progress together as a group, then everyone is progressing, and so they're helping each other to progress at the same rate, and so it really forms a small community, and as they care for each other, those relationships become, well, it becomes like a family, really. And I've heard many groups say, these people are like my family. We help each other, and if anybody's in trouble, we take care of each other. I was in a group a couple of years ago where the treasurer of the group uh, told me nobody in this group asks for charity from anybody outside of the group. If anybody in our group has a need, we help each other. And I know some of those people, and I know that in the past they were people who would look for charity wherever they could find it. And now it's happening within the group, and they're helping each other. That that so it's creating that community that really addresses the root issues of poverty.
Yeah, that's good, and I guess that kind of ties into what my last question was, which is how do you tie in the gospel with what you're doing? Because I hear a lot that the most important thing is their spiritual needs, not their physical needs, and my response is well, you can't really separate them. Like I don't think it's healthy if you separate those two things. But it sounds like you are, like you said, working to restore the relationships with God and each other. So does that come in the form of biblical teaching at the beginning of each meeting, or do you explicitly share the gospel in hopes of converting someone there who's not a Christian, or kind of how do you tie that in?
We in our curriculum we infuse the gospel message into the curriculum itself. So it's not like here's the Bible lesson, here's the finance lesson. It's integrated into the lesson, and then in every booklet that we have at least one lesson where we make a clear presentation of the gospel message, just in case someone is not a believer, that they really understand the way of salvation. But it's so important because unless a person really has that relationship with the Lord Jesus Christ and really has a right relationship with God, having more money might only make the problem worse. Peter Greer talks about, who's the president of Hope International in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. He talks about when he first did microfinance in Africa, he went to a man's house and the house was falling down. The children weren't going to school and they didn't have enough of food. And he helped him to get a microfinance loan so that he could start a small business. And uh, through the reports from the microfinance organization, he knew that within 1 year that man's income had tripled. So he went back a year later and he thought, okay, the house is going to be fixed up. The children are going to be going to school. And he went back and everything was the same. And because the man's heart hadn't been changed and his relationship with the Lord hadn't changed, he just had 3 times as much money now to spend on gambling and alcohol, and the family situation didn't change at all. But when you turn a person's heart to the Lord and they start to show compassion on their wife and their children and their priorities change, then putting more money into that man's hands is going to make a difference for the family.
That's really powerful to recognize that even something as basic as finances, which are important and are needed to be addressed, do need to be addressed. It really does come back to heart issues, though.
It does, yeah.
Cool. Well, thanks so much for coming on. Left us all a lot to think about. Where's a place
Definitely.
that where's a place folks can go to support your work? I know you don't give money directly to folks in developing countries, but I'm sure your staff need support. So is there any place they can go to find out more about your ministry or get involved if they want to?
Yeah, our website is www.openhands.org.
Great.
And yeah, and our
All
expenses,
right.
our expenses are paying our national staff and their travel
Okay.
to go visit the groups and provide teaching.
Gotcha.
Very good. It was really good to catch up with you, Merle. Thank you for sharing about your ministry. Something I'm personally going to be looking into.
Yeah, good to see you again, Drew. And Titus, nice to meet you.
Absolutely. Nice to meet you too. I don't know if we mentioned this on air that my brother Joe works with Merle, but that's kind of how we made the connection. So yeah, good to meet you.
Yep.
All right, take care.
Okay, thanks.